Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
How Africans became integral to New World history. In the past, many historians, including Marxists, accepted a model of economic determinism when discussing the origins of New World slavery and the restriction of enslavement to Native Americans and then almost exclusively to sub-Saharan Africans and their descendants. Presenting racial slavery as an economically backward but inevitable and temporary stage in historical development, given the shortage of labor and the almost limitless expanse of land in the Americas, they tended to ignore or underestimate cultural and ideological factors, especially religion. Yet there is now a broad consensus that plantation slavery, far from being archaic, was not only highly productive, but anticipated much of the efficiency, organization, and global interconnectedness of industrial capitalism. The economic historian David Eltis has also argued that if only economic forces had prevailed, Western Europeans would have revived white slavery, since it would have been much cheaper to enslave and transport white vagabonds, criminals, and prisoners of war to the New World, than to sail all the way to West Africa and purchase increasingly expensive slaves in such a distant region. But the first option, Eltis stresses, was negated by whatever cultural forces had brought a sense of unity and freedom to Christians of Western Europe, thus blocking the possibility of any significant revival of white slavery. Turning to the influence of religions, the long struggle between Christianity and Islam and the cultures they generated have seldom been given sufficient attention with respect to the changing sources of slave labor. For well over a millennium, the ultimate division between us and them, or the other, a paradigm for the polarity between masters and slaves, was nourished by the Muslim invasions of Eastern and Western Europe, by the Christian crusades into Muslim territories, by the Christian reconquest of Portugal, Spain, and the Mediterranean islands, and by the Muslim enslavement from the 1500s to the early 1800s, of well over 1 million Western Europeans from Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, and Britain. Some of these whites, who had been seized at sea or taken in larger numbers along the European coasts from Italy to England, and even Iceland, were ransomed by Europeans and publicly celebrated as symbols of the inherent freedom and non-enslavability of Christian whites, a concept that began to develop in Byzantium in the early Middle Ages, when enslavement and ransoming first became linked with religious identity. In England especially, this ceremonial liberation of English captives, who often appeared in urban parades wearing their chains and tattered slave clothing, coincided in the 18th century with a growing desire to dignify free labor, along with a kind of new nationalism signified in the early 18th century by James Thomson's famous lines that would become a kind of national anthem. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never will be slaves. As can be seen in their almost continuous wars, especially the ferocious 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, Western Europeans had few qualms about slaughtering and torturing one another, or even about exterminating civilians. Yet their own convicts, vagabonds, and prisoners of war were exempt from the kind of enslavement that seemed appropriate for Moors, and then for what the English termed blackamoors. I do not mean to minimize the importance of greed, economic self-interest, and an increasing desire for greater productivity and profit, all of which lay at the heart of early modern and modern slavery. But these economic desires were also fused with issues of identity, ideology, and power. In Chapter 3, we considered at least 4 cultural preconditions for the anti-black racism that dominated the white settlement and development of the Americas, especially from the late 17th century onward. First, and I will not follow the exact order of topics in Chapter 3, there were the strong sanctions for slavery in the West's religious and philosophical heritage extending back to the Hebrew and Christian Bibles and to the classical literature of the Greco-Roman era. Thus, chattel slavery remained an acceptable institution even after it had disappeared from northwest Europe, and after the Barbary corsairs underscored the belief that Christians from Western Europe could not be legitimately enslaved. Ironically, the revival and rediscovery of classical learning, supposedly a liberating step toward progress, gave new support for slavery in the Renaissance. But whereas Roman slaves had included virtually all the ethnic groups then available, the emerging modern world would be more influenced by the ancient Israelite distinction between Hebrew and enemy Canaanite slaves, and by the Islamic laws against forcibly enslaving free Muslims. This need to enslave outsiders, except in Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, which differed in demography and cultural traditions, also tied in with the ancient Greco-Roman conviction that external facial and physical traits correlated with internal mental and characterological strengths and weaknesses that were hereditary even if originally derived from climate and geography. The second precondition we considered was the medieval Arab precedent of enslaving and transporting by ship or caravan enormous numbers of black Africans, who came to be seen as especially suited for the most degrading forms of work. In marked contrast to the enslaved Europeans in North Africa, hardly any of these black slaves were redeemed by their own people, though many were converted to Islam and some were freed by their owners. Third, there is evidence suggesting that racist stereotypes, as well as a racist interpretation of the biblical curse of Ham, were transmitted by Iberian Muslims to Christians, who by the 1400s were already becoming obsessed with the alleged danger that Jews and new Christians posed to their own purity of blood. This incipient racism was then magnified in the 15th century, when the Portuguese imported increasing numbers of West African slaves, who were auctioned in Lisbon or shipped to Spanish cities from Seville to Valencia. Still, unlike England, which deported its small Jewish population in 1290 and attempted to deport its small number of blacks in the late 1500s, Spain and Portugal absorbed much Jewish and especially Moorish culture. Despite Spain's expulsion of Jews and then Moriscos, converted Moors, Iberians became accustomed to the coexistence of a range of skin colors from black to white. A fact of life that would lead to a greater acceptance of racial intermixture in their future colonies in the New World. This point, particularly when we take account of the much lighter-skinned people of northwestern Europe, brings us back to a fourth and final precondition, the negative connotations and symbolism of the color black. Having briefly considered the mixed and complex imagery associated with black in medieval Europe, it is sufficient to note that the deeply imprinted visual memories derived from depictions of black demons, devils, and torturers could, and no doubt did, reinforce other factors in creating a perception of the ultimate outsiders, even more alien than Arabs and Jews, as the blacks from distant and pagan Africa. If some popes could welcome delegations of black Christians from Jerusalem and Ethiopia, Portugal's discovery of West Africa brought papal approval of black slavery and even the shipment of some black slaves as gifts to popes and their friends in Rome. By 1750, when the British Crown finally sanctioned African-American slavery in the English colony of Georgia, any informed observer would have had grounds for concluding that, from the very beginning, the Western Hemisphere could not have been colonized and settled without the importation of staggering amounts of African slave labor. In 1735, slavery had been excluded by a special law for rendering the colony of Georgia more defensible from Spanish Florida. This goal complemented the initial desire to create just south of slave-populous Carolina an economically productive refuge for orphans, debtors who had been imprisoned, and European refugees. But the law excluding slaves proved to be impossible to enforce. In 1750, black slaves could be seen in an uninterrupted succession of colonies from French Canada and New England all the way south to the Spanish settlements in Chile and Argentina. In the Caribbean, they constituted up to 90% or more of the population of the richest colonies in the world, and the demand for such productive slaves continued to rise in one colony after another. In retrospect, it appears that the entire New World enterprise depended on the enormous and expandable flow of slave labor from Africa. Though in 1495, Columbus transported some 500 Native American slaves to Seville and dreamed of a profitable slave trade of American Indians to Iberia, Italy, Sicily, and the Atlantic Islands, some African slaves arrived in the Caribbean at least as early as 1501. By 1820, nearly 8.7 million slaves had departed from Africa for the New World, as opposed to only 2.6 million whites, many of them convicts or indentured servants, who had left Europe. Thus, by 1820, African slaves constituted almost 77% of the enormous population that had sailed toward the Americas, and from 1760 to 1820, this emigrating flow included 5.6 African slaves for every European. From 1820 to 1880, the African slave trade, most of it now illegal, continued to ship off from Africa nearly 2.3 million more slaves, mainly to Brazil and Cuba. In other words, there can be no doubt that black slave labor was essential in creating and developing the original New World that began by the 1840s to attract so many millions of European immigrants. By the early 1700s, most English merchants and political leaders agreed with the eminent economist Malachy Postlethwaite. The Negro trade and the natural consequences resulting from it may be justly esteemed an inexhaustible fund of wealth and naval power to this nation. For Josiah Child, Charles Davenant, and other influential political economists who thought in terms of global strategy and the development of a self-sufficient mercantilist and imperial economy, the African trade had those characteristics of a divinely contrived system, the kind of system that greatly appealed to the 18th century mind, in France as well as England. It was now argued that the slave trade to the British colonies prevented the emigration of large numbers of white laborers that would deprive England not only of workers but of consumers, and the African markets for the goods that were exchanged for slaves stimulated both shipping and manufacturing. We will later specify the kinds of imports that induced Africans to sell so many slaves to Europeans and Americans. British defenders of their relatively new Atlantic slave system emphasized the way it stimulated domestic jobs for iron manufacturers, gun makers, shipbuilders, refiners, rope makers, sail makers, weavers, and scores of other trades, just as exports to the West Indies had become vital to the prosperity of New England and the Middle Colonies. Moreover, the slave trade helped to provide Britain with a favorable balance of trade, and surplus blacks could be illegally sold to the Spanish colonies in exchange for gold and silver. Even the slaves should benefit, it was claimed, since they were rescued from being killed, starved, or cannibalized in primitive Africa and were taken to Christian lands where they were well fed, supposedly in their owners' self-interest, where they had their own garden plots, and where they at least had a chance of becoming gradually civilized. Jean Barbeau, a French slave ship captain, claimed that he conducted the trade according to the Golden Rule, and argued that other European traders and owners should treat blacks as they themselves would want to be treated if they had the misfortune of being captured by the Algerian corsairs from North Africa. In the beginning, however, the European maritime nations, from Spain and Portugal in the 1500s to France and England in the 1600s, did not undertake New World colonization with the intent of relying on African slaves. South Carolina is arguably an exception. Despite the importance of the preconditions we have considered, the New World of 1750 emerged from a long series of fortuitous, haphazard, and even catastrophic events, especially as the Mediterranean patterns of piracy, banditry, plunder, cruelty, and ruthless reprisals were transferred to the Caribbean. In Central America, for example, where the conquistadors were disappointed by the absence of tribute in comparison with Mexico, they found some compensation by branding Indian slaves on the face and shipping some 67,000 to Panama, Peru, and the Caribbean. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the colonizing powers relied heavily on Indian labor, and in the 17th century the British in Barbados and Virginia depended for many decades on a large flow of white indentured servants, who long outnumbered black slaves. Moving back again to origins, Venetian and Genoese merchants were at the forefront in developing conquered Arab sugar-producing regions in the Mediterranean, in supplying non-African slaves for a variety of economic needs in addition to sugar production, and finally in extending the system for slave-grown sugar to the so-called Atlantic islands of Madeira, the Canaries, the Cape Verdes, and São Tomé, off the west coast of Africa. Here, in order to grasp a more global picture, we should mention again the changing sources of slave labor from the 1200s to the late 1400s, a subject that highlights shifting boundaries and provides perspective on the ultimate choice of Africans. Following the Western capture of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade, 1204, Italian merchants participated in a booming long-distance seaborne trade that transported tens of thousands of white Armenian, Bulgarian, Circassian, Mingrelian, and Georgian slaves from regions around the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov to Mediterranean markets extending from Muslim Egypt and Syria to Christian Crete, Cyprus, Sicily, and eastern Spain. The slaves were used for the production of sugar as well as for numerous other services. What needs to be stressed is that the Tatars and other slave traders north of the Black Sea were as eager as their later African counterparts to march streams of captives, in this case mostly white captives, to shoreline markets, where they could be exchanged for coveted goods. Between 1414 and 1423, no fewer than 10,000 bondsmen, mostly bondswomen, to meet the demand for household servants, were sold in Florence alone. In the early 1400s, this white slave trade from the Black Sea foreshadowed almost every aspect of the African slave trade, which was about to begin, including complex organization, permanent posts or forts for trade, and long-distance shipment by sea to multinational markets. In fact, although the Portuguese began importing black African slaves in the 1440s, the region between the Black and Caspian Seas might conceivably have been a significant source of slaves for New World settlements after 1492, and we have noted that a very few white Eastern slaves were shipped to Hispanic America. But in 1453, the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, and thus the entrance from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. The Turks soon diverted the flow of Black Sea and Balkan captives solely to Islamic markets. Turkish expansion brought an end to Italian colonization efforts in the eastern Mediterranean and sharply reduced Europe's supply of sugar. The Turks also cut off Christian Europe from its major source of slaves, and for most potential buyers the price of slaves became prohibitive. Aside from captured Muslims, the only alternative to the Crimea and the steppes of Western Asia, given the understood prohibition against enslaving Western Europeans, was sub-Saharan Africa. For a time, this new demand stimulated the Arab caravan trade across the Sahara. Hence, a very few black slaves taken to the shores of Libya and Tunisia were dispersed to Sicily, Naples, Majorca, southern France, and Mediterranean Spain. In Sicily, a notary recording in Latin referred to sclavi negri, literally black Slavs, who outnumbered white slaves by the 1490s. At the same time, Genoese capital and technology had strengthened Portuguese sea power, and Portugal's harbors had proved to be ideal for the small ships, mostly owned by Italian merchants, that carried commodities from the Near East to England and Western Europe. Some of the same Italian merchant and banking families long involved in the Black Sea slave trade now sent agents to Seville and Lisbon, where they became pioneers in developing the African slave trade. For example, Bartolomeo Marchioni, who represented one such family, moved in 1470 from Florence to Lisbon. He soon owned sugar plantations in Madeira, worked by black slaves, and the King of Portugal granted him a monopoly for slave trading on the Guinea coast. There could hardly be a clearer example of the continuity between the late medieval Black Sea Mediterranean slave networks and the emerging Atlantic slave system, both energized by the expansion and westward movement of sugar cultivation. The Portuguese naval expeditions to West Africa in the mid-1400s were originally intended to find wheat and barley, to outflank the Arab caravan trade, to find the rich sources of gold and pepper south of Mali, and perhaps to find Prester John, a legendary Christian ruler somewhere beyond the Islamic world. In the event, Prince Henry's voyagers also initiated a direct slave trade between West Africa and Lisbon, and began to colonize the uninhabited Madeira Islands, at first using as slaves the light-skinned Guanche natives of the Canary Islands, who had also been enslaved and massacred by the Spaniards. By the time of Columbus's first American voyage in 1492, Madeira had already become a wealthy sugar colony mainly dependent on the labor of black African slaves. The Atlantic Islands had originally been bases for pirates and sources for water and supplies for mariners. Partly because they presented less risk of tropical diseases than the African mainland, they then became major sites of agricultural production. As the first true colony committed to sugar monoculture and increasingly to black slave labor, Madeira was the transitional prototype for later mercantilist ideals of empire. Madeira soon outstripped the entire Mediterranean in the production of sugar, which was re-exported by the late 1490s to England, France, Italy, and even the eastern Mediterranean. Columbus, who had lived for over 10 years on an island near Madeira, had the foresight to take sugarcane from the Spanish Canary Islands on his second voyage to the Indies in 1493. Meanwhile, as early as 1495, São Tomé, situated much farther south in the Gulf of Guinea, was shipping slave-grown sugar directly to Antwerp, long the major refining and distributing center for Europe. For the next half-century, São Tomé would import more African slaves than Europe, the Americas, or the other Atlantic islands combined. Some wealthy Africans in Angola actually invested in sugar plantations on São Tomé, which also became a gathering place for slaves whom the Portuguese then sold to Africans in exchange for gold, or later shipped westward to the Americas. By 1507, there were about 2,000 slaves working on São Tomé's sugar plantations, and another 5,000 to 6,000 awaiting re-export. In summary, then, while African slaves were not part of original European blueprints for colonizing the Americas, except for South Carolina, spatial boundaries had shifted even by the 1490s in a way that would easily enable Europeans to draw on an enormous potential supply of African slave labor, aided, I should add, by the favorable system of Atlantic winds and currents, and by the later cultivation in Africa of such highly nutritious New World crops as manioc or cassava, corn, maize, and squash, which had the long-term effect of greatly increasing the West African population. Columbus's once celebrated voyage of 1492 was anything but an isolated event. It was part of an almost explosive cluster of Spanish and Portuguese explorations that discovered and mastered in the space of a decade the major ocean currents and wind systems of the North and South Atlantic, which had kept the Western Hemisphere protected from earlier invasions, and also isolated from many of the diseases of Eurasia and Africa. These Atlantic winds and currents suddenly became the means, beginning in the 1490s, of major intercontinental contact that would have, as we shall see, catastrophic consequences for both Amerindian and African populations. This first step toward globalization was made possible by several engineering or technological innovations. One of them was the caravel, a fast maneuverable sailing vessel with lateen and triangular sails for sailing close to the wind, a ship adapted from an earlier Arab model. The Portuguese caravels and large Spanish navios could sail to almost any point in the world's oceans and return. No less important was the compass, which probably came via the Arabs from China, and such navigational instruments as the astrolabe and quadrant, which allowed accurate readings of the heavenly bodies and enabled sailors to plot a ship's latitude at sea. For some instruments, as well as charts and maps, navigators owed much to Jewish cosmographers in Portugal and Majorca. In 1488, when Bartholomew Dias ran into contrary winds and currents along the southwestern African coast, he swung out in a wide circle and rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that it was possible to sail from the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. In 1497, Vasco da Gama followed a wide arc of wind systems in the South Atlantic. For 93 days he was out of sight of land, compared to the 33 days of Columbus's first voyage. But once in the Indian Ocean, where da Gama drew on Arab sailing experience, he succeeded in reaching India. By the 1550s, Japanese screen paintings depicted the arrival of tall, long-nosed Portuguese traders, closely followed and fanned in the heat by barefoot black African slaves. The Portuguese thus accomplished what Columbus had claimed to have done, reaching Asia by sea. From their accidental discovery of Brazil in 1500 to their interactions with Southeast Asia and China in 1513, the Portuguese were the first to grasp the strategic meaning of world geography and to achieve dominion of the major seas and oceans. This meant that they soon displaced the Venetians in importing spices from Asia and gaining hegemony over trade in gold, spices, and slaves from Africa. By 1565, when the Portuguese had been trading with the Japanese for 30 years, the rapidity of change was also symbolized by a Spanish galleon that sailed east across the Pacific from the Philippines, finally unloading a cargo of cinnamon in Mexico. I would also underscore the multinational character of the imperial ventures that created an Atlantic slave system for the production of sugar, coffee, rice, tobacco, and other New World products. Columbus himself, a seaman from Genoa, was part of a larger picture that included colonies of Italian traders, bankers, and sailors in Lisbon, Seville, and other Atlantic ports, men who soon became deeply involved with West African trade. The connections extended to the great Italian merchant banking families, who were skilled at raising capital, selling insurance, and handling bills of credit and exchange, all of which became essential for lengthy voyages that delayed any return of profits for several years. Moreover, some Italian bankers and moneylenders were also linked with great German merchant capitalist families such as the Fugers and Welsers of Augsburg. The Fugers, descended from a Bavarian weaver, moved from banking and providing loans to popes and kings, such as Emperor Charles V, to leasing mines in Spain and Hungary that produced especially copper, a commodity much desired in sub-Saharan Africa as well as Europe. Many of these rich merchant bankers first concentrated on importing spices from India and silver from Spanish America, at a time when Europe had few major exports. Silver was even more valued in India than in Europe. Soon, however, the merchant bankers also turned to sugar, and it is no exaggeration to say that the sugar colonies in the Atlantic islands, followed by those in Brazil and the Caribbean, were made possible by investment capital from merchant bankers who then reaped enormous profits by marketing sugar and other slave-grown produce throughout Europe. Even in its early stages, the Atlantic slave system foreshadowed certain features of our modern global economy. One sees international investment of capital in distant colonial regions, where the slave trade resulted in extremely low labor costs to produce goods for a transatlantic market. With respect to consumerism, it is now clear that slave-produced sugar, rum, coffee, tobacco, and chocolate greatly altered the European diet. Apart from their damaging effects, ranging from sugar-induced tooth decay to lung cancer, these luxuries helped to shape by the late 18th century a consumer mentality among the masses, especially in England, so that workers became more pliant and willing to accept factory discipline in order to afford their luxury stimulants. 15th-century Portuguese leaders, such as Prince Henry the Navigator, initially saw the country's southward voyages along the West African coast as a continuation of their long struggle to defeat and expel the Moors from Portugal, culminating in 1415 with their invasion of the northwest tip of Africa and capture of Ceuta and Casablanca in Morocco. Yet when the Portuguese attacked some African blacks south of the river Senegal, they were badly defeated. Even by the mid-1400s, it became clear that given the distances involved, to say nothing of the Africans' military power, peaceful cooperation and trade with the coastal peoples was the only way to obtain slaves as well as gold, Malagueta pepper, called grains of paradise, and other desired goods. Unfortunately, slaves eventually superseded all other exports. As the historian John Thornton has vividly shown, European slave traders dealt with Africans as equals, at least from the mid-15th to the end of the 17th century. If West Africans lacked ships that could sail on the high seas, their numerous vessels were fast, maneuverable, and filled with skillful archers and javelin men, and the quality of West African iron and steel at least equaled that of European. West Africans could and did attack and even sink some European ships, and the rulers of Congo, Benin, and some other regions succeeded at times in temporarily stopping the trade in slaves. Yet it is crucially important to recognize that Europeans profited from the total lack of any pan-African consciousness. Similarity in skin color and other bodily traits, as Europeans viewed them, brought no sense of a common African identity. But if Africans were themselves divided into many ethnic groups, or above all, into family or clan lineages based on highly respected ancestors, they quickly learned how to play off one group of Europeans against another, and how to maximize the inflow of European goods. Portuguese ship captains and other Europeans soon learned the need to present ceremonial gifts to African rulers and to pay fees and taxes, even to anchor and to engage in trade. In addition, the whites were often required to pay for butlers, messengers, trunk keepers, and washerwomen, among others. and they very seldom gained access to the Africans' actual networks and procedures for producing gold and slaves. As late as 1721, after a half-century of transporting slaves across the Atlantic, the British Royal African Company asked its agents in Africa to investigate modes of enslavement in the interior and find out whether there were any sources besides that of being taken prisoners in wartime, a striking example of the limitations of European knowledge and control. In the 1400s, as in many preceding centuries, indigenous slavery and slave trading were very widespread in West Africa. But Europeans had no better understanding of the nature of African slavery than Africans had of the emerging New World plantation system to which the slaves they sold would be sent. When black slaves boarded the European slave ships, many, like the Amistad captives we discussed in Chapter 1, assumed they would be taken to some place where they would be killed and eaten. European elites exercised power over the European masses by means of private, revenue-producing land, exemplified in the landlord-tenant relationship. By contrast, as John Thornton puts it, slavery was widespread in Atlantic Africa because slaves were the only form of private revenue-producing property recognized in African law. In West Africa, land was owned by the state as a corporation, and thus the main symbols of private wealth and success were large numbers of slaves, and wives in accordance with socially accepted polygyny. And while many slaves were treated much like peasant farmers, and some served as administrators, soldiers, and even royal advisors, others labored in mines or were ritually used for human sacrifice. Despite the huge cultural differences, the African and European forms of slavery were, in Thornton's words, legally indistinguishable, and the African political and economic elites were eager to sell large numbers of slaves to whoever would pay, and thus fueled the Atlantic slave trade. The words would pay take on appalling significance when we note that in the period between 1680 and 1830, when the trade had its most devastating effects on Africa, the price paid for slaves in Senegambia rose by 1,031%. When in 1482 the Portuguese built their famous fortress at São Jorge da Mina, Elmina, in present-day Ghana, it was intended to protect their newly purchased gold from European interlopers, not from Africans. And Elmina, captured by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, would soon become a major base for collecting and housing slaves awaiting shipment. Much later, when some inexperienced and freelance white traders did occasionally seize and enslave black coastal people, as the British slave-trading Royal African Company complained, they invited harsh African retaliation. Such anarchy also threatened the elaborate mercantile network that enabled European traders to deal with African princes, kings, and merchants, who sold slaves for textiles, often Asian, liquor, hardware, bars of iron, guns, gunpowder, tools or utensils of various kinds, and cowrie shells, widely used as currency and brought from the distant Maldive Islands. There has long been a widespread mythology claiming that Europeans were the ones who physically enslaved Africans, as if small groups of sailors, who were highly vulnerable to tropical diseases and who had no supply lines to their homelands, could kidnap some 11 to 12 million Africans. In actuality, from 1482 to the 1530s, the Portuguese even purchased gold in the Elmina section of the Gold Coast in exchange for large numbers of black slaves, whom they had purchased farther east and southward, where slaves were cheaper. Africans in the Elmina region and elsewhere expressed a growing demand for slaves who could be used as porters to carry European goods into the interior. Eventually, King John III of Portugal feudally declared that this sale of slaves to infidels was immoral and should be stopped, an edict that the king could hardly enforce. Most Portuguese ships carried black interpreters, trained in Portugal or São Tomé, who went ashore with the captain to haggle and bargain with local rulers over the price of slaves. On some slave ships, especially Portuguese, at least a few black seamen worked alongside whites. Some were slaves, who were required to turn over most of their earnings to their owners. Others were free blacks. Men of mixed descent even commanded Brazilian and Portuguese slave ships, and one African slave trader sailed all the way to Barbados, where he sold his slaves before returning to Africa. As the island of São Tomé became a gathering point for slaves, some working on local plantations before being sent to America, there was increasing intermixture between whites and blacks. By 1550, some of the daughters of rich black planters had married Portuguese settlers. A scattering of Portuguese adventurers, including New Christians or the descendants of Jews, even braved the risks of malaria and other diseases and settled on the African mainland. In the early 19th century, the annual death rates for British troops on the Gold Coast was as high as 668 per 1,000. Called tangomaus or lançados, they lived like Africans, left many mulatto descendants, and often served as intermediaries for the selling and buying of slaves. In the 16th century, Portugal issued licenses, which were usually then sold or subcontracted for acquiring and transporting African slaves. Spain was officially barred from Africa by Pope Alexander VI's 1493 Treaty of Tordesillas, which drew a longitudinal line dividing the Atlantic into Portuguese and Spanish zones of influence. Spain gaining the most unexplored New World except for the as yet undiscovered Brazil, which extended eastward into Portugal's domain. Spain, nevertheless, became increasingly determined to use exclusive contracts called asientos to monopolize and control the supply of slave labor to its American colonies. But not only were asientos sold and subcontracted, privateers and interlopers from various European countries continued to break any meaningful monopoly. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch had gained a major share of the African slave trade, and leadership then passed to England and to a lesser degree France, until the early 19th century. From 1650 to 1810, the British, who won Spain's asiento in 1713, transported the greatest number of Africans to the New World, though they and the Americans outlawed their own slave trading in 1808. Because the Portuguese took the lead before 1650 and after 1810, they ultimately carried the most Africans to the Americas. In the early 1500s, Portugal's King Manuel I recognized the African king of Congo, Afonso I, as a brother and ally who would aid Portugal's efforts to Christianize the vast region to the north and south of the Congo River. Also known as Nzinga Mabemba, Afonso became Congo's second Christian king. With the aid of knowledgeable clerks, he carried on an extensive correspondence with Portugal's ruler. Historians have often quoted lines from Afonso's amazing letter dated July 6, 1526, in which he pleads for help in curbing the terrible damages inflicted by the slave trade. Merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and sons of our noblemen and vassals, and our relatives, because the African thieves and men of bad conscience grab them, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom. So great, sir, is the corruption and licentiousness that our country is being completely depopulated. It is our will that in these kingdoms there should not be any trade of slaves nor outlet for them. John Thornton, who had studied the entire correspondence, warns that these bitter words can be easily misinterpreted. At this moment, Afonso deplored the unofficial aid that some Portuguese had given the ruler of rival Ndongo, which had led to the capture and sale of Afonso's subjects and even nobles. Yet Afonso personally participated in the slave trade, along with his nobles, and he soon wrote a quite different letter describing a new policy of appointing his own inspectors to ensure that the people sold as slaves had been legally enslaved. But if Afonso accepted both slavery and the export of slaves, he fervently believed in lawful regulation, and in 1525 had even seized a French ship and its crew because they were trading illegally, without royal permission. Thornton stresses that Afonso and his immediate successors were successful not only in curbing internal robbery and limiting the export of slaves, but also in spreading Christianity and literacy and maintaining profitable contacts with Portugal and the Vatican. As a result, Portuguese slave traders soon moved south and focused their attention on Angola, where they established a permanent settlement as well as military alliances and interactions in local conflicts. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Portuguese established many of the practices for transporting slaves by ship, such as the total separation of the sexes, which the other maritime nations would adopt in the centuries to come. The conditions on transatlantic slave ships, which David Eltis has termed the purest form of domination in the history of slavery, were probably too horrible to convey in human words. The density of packing slaves in the decks between a ship's bottom hold and main deck far exceeded the crowding of indentured servants or even Irish prisoners shipped to the British Caribbean. The males, especially, had to lie like spoons locked together, with no real standing room above them, surrounded by urine and feces, with little air to breathe. One would need to turn to the suffering of slaves in ancient Greek silver mines or to the victims of Nazi death camps to find worse or roughly equivalent examples of what Eltis calls sheer awfulness. Matters hardly improved in the 19th century. The illegal slave ships captured by the British between 1839 and 1852 had an average of 4 square feet for each slave, compared with the 12 square feet required by British law for contemporary North Atlantic immigrant ships, the same space roughly given to modern economy fare passengers on a Boeing 747. As David Eltis puts it, the occupant of the typical slave ship could neither lie full length nor stand upright for 5 weeks, except for the limited time spent above deck each day. Consider some of the eyewitness testimony given in 1790 and 1791 to a select committee of the British House of Commons. After meals they are made to jump in their irons up on the deck. This is called dancing by the slave dealers. In every ship he, the witness, has been desired to flog such as would not jump. He had generally a cat of 9 tails in his hand. In his ship, even those who had the flux, scurvy, and such edematous swellings in their legs as made it painful to them to move at all, were compelled to dance by the cat. The captain ordered them to sing, and they sung songs of sorrow. When the scuttles are obliged to be shut, the gratings are not sufficient for airing the rooms. He, Dr. Trotter, a ship surgeon, never himself could breathe freely, unless immediately under the hatchway. He has seen the slaves drawing their breath with all those laborious and anxious efforts for life, which are observed in expiring animals, subjected by experiment to foul air. Mr. Alexander Falconbridge also states on this head that when employed in stowing the slaves, he made the most of the room and wedged them in. They had not so much room as a man in his coffin, either in length or breadth. It was impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree of ease. He had often occasion to go from one side of their rooms to the other, in which case he always took off his shoes, but could not avoid pinching them. He has the marks on his feet where they bit and scratched him. He says he cannot conceive any situation so dreadful and disgusting as that of the slaves when ill of the flux. In the ship Alexander, the deck was covered with blood and mucus, and resembled a slaughterhouse. The stench and foul air were intolerable. Captains of slave ships faced a difficult dilemma. They longed to maximize profits by maximizing the number of slaves taken on each voyage, yet they feared both lethal slave revolts and an increase in slave mortality that would reduce their own share of the total New World sales. Unlike most planters, they had virtually no personal contact with the slaves. They felt no constraints on ordering the most sadistic public punishments in order to terrify the cargo. A Portuguese caravel could carry as many as 150 slaves, and a 3-masted navio could hold as many as 400 as well as provisions for a long voyage. By the 18th century, a typical French slaver would transport as many as 400 slaves, but British ships were much smaller. Because of the danger of revolt, ships had to carry much larger crews than on ordinary voyages. In the 1500s, an average middle passage voyage took from 2 to 3 months. By the late 1700s, such transatlantic trips lasted about a month, but of course, much depended on weather and the distance to the New World destination. From the time of the first voyages to the Americas, male slaves were bound by chains, manacles, neck rings, and padlocks, though when out of sight of land and when weather permitted, crew members brought them to the deck for exercise, including forced dancing, as we have seen, and some coerced labor. Slave mortality, most of it from dehydration, including dysentery or the flux, averaged around 15%, but could easily range from as low as 5% to 33% or even more. Mortality decreased somewhat by the 19th century. A major motive for separating the women was the fear that they would encourage the males to revolt, but the separation of sexes also made it far easier for members of the crew to rape black women, a very common occurrence. In actuality, slaves did rebel on approximately 10% of all slave ships, usually when still near the African coast. This resistance significantly increased the cost of the African slave trade, in terms of added crew, guns, and insurance, and thus prevented still more African slaves from being shipped to the New World. It is important to remember that in the beginning, African slaves were not taken to the Americas, but rather to Iberia and the Atlantic Islands. Brazil only began importing a significant number of black slaves in the late 1500s, approximately 140 years after they were first brought into Portugal. It took another century before the truly hemispheric slave trade began to rise to wholly new levels, peaking in the late 18th century. From 1700 to 1880, an estimated 9.47 million slaves were deported from Africa, or about 86.3% of the total transatlantic slave migration, not counting shipboard mortality. Yet as early as 1550, black slaves constituted 10% of Lisbon's population of about 100,000. When the Africans arrived in Portugal, merchants divided them into lots according to age, sex, and physical condition. They were then paraded stark naked for inspection by prospective buyers, and sold by brokers who dealt with them as livestock, as if they had been horses or cattle. The same procedure became almost universal when the slaves were first sold to European buyers. Upon each sale, a white man would brand the slave, usually on a cheek, sometimes on both cheeks. The price of such chattel more than doubled during the first half of the 16th century, especially as they were re-exported to Spain and the Mediterranean. Like Moors and Jews, blacks were often called dogs or bitches, and there is considerable evidence that most Portuguese whites regarded blacks as inherently inferior or even as a separate species, displaying the color of the devil. Since various popes authorized the buying of slaves who had supposedly been taken in a just war for a just cause, it was generally agreed that these terms applied to people who were guilty of cannibalism, sodomy, incest, or simply living naked like beasts, in ignorance of the civilized standards of life. Even so, since the Church insisted that all human beings possessed immortal souls, popes and clerics demanded that the slaves be Christianized. In a letter of 1513 to the Pope, Portugal's King Manuel I conveyed much concern over the fact that many blacks from Guinea had died at sea before they could receive baptism. He ordered all masters to be sure that all black adults had been baptized within 6 months of landing. While complaints persisted for decades that many slaves had still not been baptized, the Portuguese, in marked contrast to later English colonists in the Caribbean and North America, encouraged blacks to form their own segregated religious confraternities, dedicated to the cult of Our Lady of the Rosary. No less striking, the Portuguese loved the Africans' music and enlisted the slaves to perform at plays and other types of public entertainment, even at royal functions. Little could the later British slave ship captains, who forced slaves for exercise to dance on deck to the sound of bagpipes, dream that these African descendants would revolutionize popular music on a global level in the 20th century. In Portugal, the Africans were much less feared than Moorish slaves, who had much greater possibilities for escape or ransom. The historian Deborah Blumenthal presents much evidence to show that in Spain 15th-century Valencians could not conceive of anyone more base or vile than a black male slave. Yet precisely because black African slaves were so far removed from their places of origin, they were truly natally alienated, to use Orlando Patterson's term, and just as whites in colonial South Carolina relied for many decades on arming their black slaves to beat off Indian and Spanish attacks, so wealthy Valencians armed trusted black slaves and used them to insult rivals or enemies and to protect their masters and especially their masters' honor. Moreover, in Portugal, black slaves were soon owned by whites and even free blacks of almost all social classes, including laborers, sailors, and even prostitutes, who were legally prohibited from having free servants. Despite the widespread anti-black racism in Portugal and Spain, blacks won a significant degree of acceptance among poor Portuguese whites, in sharp contrast to 19th century America. Socialization led to some interracial marriages, almost always between white men and mulatto women. As in later Latin America, and less formally and less universally in the United States, mulattoes acquired a much higher status than blacks. By the late 1500s, then, the central elements of an Atlantic slave system had already emerged. When we take account of the increasing flow of Africans to Brazil and to the Spanish-American colonies, along with the rise of great sugar refining and distributing centers in Antwerp and then in Amsterdam, one wonders why the emergence of such a slave-driven economy evokes so little protest, especially in view of the disappearance of slavery several centuries earlier in Western Europe and the rhetorical unease or even repudiation of domestic slavery in such countries as France, Holland, and especially England. This latter is best symbolized, perhaps, by the use of such words as servant or handmaiden when translating the biblical Greek and Latin words for slave in the first Bibles to reach a truly wide audience. It is true that in August 1444, at the first public auction of African slaves in Portugal, near Lagos on the southern coast, many of the common people, enraged by the cries and moans prompted by the separation of slave families, temporarily interrupted the proceeding. Even Gomes Eanes de Zurara, the official chronicler for the Portuguese king, whom I quoted in Chapter 3, expressed sorrow and sympathy for the slaves' sufferings. But the Portuguese, like diverse African peoples, had long been familiar with slavery in a variety of forms, and accepted hierarchical societies headed by authoritarian or even divinely chosen kings. Today it also requires an imaginative leap to picture the state of human life in even supposedly advanced nations in the 15th and 16th centuries. When life expectancy at birth rose only to the low 20s, everyone was accustomed to ghastly rates of death from disease, especially in towns and cities, where epidemics killed up to 20% of the people every 25 or 30 years. Moreover, much of the population always remained on the verge of starvation, and officials left decomposing corpses in open pits, like the offal of butchered animals in the streets of London. In Lisbon, after numerous complaints over the public ubiquity of black people's corpses, the city constructed a special and segregated pit. If the stench of death lessened as one moved outside urban Europe, other odors did not, partly because bathhouses had long been associated with the sexual profligacy of late Roman times. Europeans bathed very seldom, if at all. Indeed, there is repeated testimony that West Africans, who did bathe and oil their skin, were revolted by the strong odor of white sailors, and were even more shocked by the whites' undisguised flatulence. That said, thieves and robbers infested the countryside. In Genoa, the homeless poor sold themselves as galley slaves every winter. Throughout Europe, authorities pursued and burned at the stake thousands of women and men accused of witchcraft. In the St. Bartholomew Massacre of 1572, Catholics slaughtered 50,000 Protestant, Huguenot, men, women, and children. Their body parts were sold openly in the streets, and Pope Gregory XIII ordered bonfires to be kindled in celebration of this Catholic triumph. In short, New World slavery emerged at a time when most people took it for granted that this world was a very cruel, sinful, and brutal place. Until the late 18th century, with its own French Reign of Terror, the European public was not only insensitive, but rushed to witness the most terrible spectacles of torture, dismemberment, and death. In view of this cold-blooded culture, it is perhaps remarkable that the emerging African slave trade drew as much courageous fire as it did. While he never condemned slavery in principle, the great Spanish and Jesuit theologian and moralist Luis de Molina delivered scathing attacks on the ways in which Africans were being enslaved. Tomás de Mercado of Seville was only one of several Spanish jurists who correctly stressed that the high prices Europeans offered for slaves in Africa encouraged every form of trickery, fraud, and violence. Slave hunters raided villages, judges accepted trumped-up charges in order to sentence people to slavery, and fathers even sold their own children for the slightest disobedience. Mercado's description of the stench and overcrowding of slave ships in 1571 was as horrifying as the testimony presented by British abolitionists in the late 1780s and early 1790s. Bartolomé Frias de Albornoz, a great Spanish lawyer living in Mexico, even denied that Christianity could justify the violence of the slave trade, and was radical enough in his sometimes sarcastic attack on African slavery to have his work condemned by the Inquisition. But in 1573, the world was hardly ready for an abolitionist movement. The critics focused on the abusive methods of African enslavement, not on the principle of slavery itself. Even so, they had no influence on political or clerical policy. Nevertheless, we have noted that Europeans transported relatively few African slaves to the New World until the late 1500s. The slave trade's effects on Africa would have been very limited if the major markets for slave labor had continued to be Europe and the Atlantic Islands. Why, then, did the Americas become so dependent on an almost limitless flow of slave labor from Africa? The Caribbean's so-called Greater Antilles, Hispaniola, later divided between French Saint-Domingue and Spanish Santo Domingo, Jamaica, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, were densely populated with millions of indigenous peoples. Yet in marked contrast with Portugal's long recognition of the West Africans' power and sovereignty, and with the attempts of the Portuguese and other Europeans to negotiate trade with various African groups, the Spaniards became intoxicated by prospects of sudden wealth, soon symbolized by rivers rich with gold. With guns and attack dogs, they seized much land from the relatively passive Arawak Taino Indians, and generally passed by the smaller islands in the Lesser Antilles, which were defended by fierce Carib Indians. After some early efforts to enslave indigenous peoples in the Americas, which were later condemned by Spain and the papacy, the Spaniards relied on the encomienda, a semi-feudal system of tributary labor first applied to the conquered Moors in Spain. Since in theory the main justification for ruling the Indians was to convert them to Christianity and a Christian way of life, the system supposedly required a Spanish master, or encomendero, to protect and slowly Christianize a small community of Indians in exchange for tribute. The tribute could be in the form of crops, personal service, or work in underground mines. In actuality, not only did the Spaniards continue to enslave some Indians, but encomenderos made large fortunes by exploiting Indian workers, as if they were worthless slaves who could not be sold or purchased. If the Indians had certain freedoms that were usually denied slaves, they hardly represented free labor in any meaningful sense, and as the encomienda system helped to destroy native populations in the Caribbean, it spread with some modifications from New Spain, Mexico, to Central and South America. To make matters worse, the Arawak Taino culture had been productive but depended on a fragile ecology. For example, high earth mounds for yucca, beans, maize, and other crops. These mounds were rapidly destroyed by the Spaniards' cattle and especially hogs, which quickly multiplied and in time severely damaged the base of the Indians' food supply. Moreover, as we have already noted, the Amerindians throughout the hemisphere had little capacity for resisting imported diseases, both temperate and tropical pathogens, including smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, influenza, typhus, and the plague. Given the previous isolation of the Western Hemisphere, this disaster has been called a virgin soil pandemic. Even whites suffered heavy mortality. Of the 2,500 colonists who arrived in Hispaniola in 1502, 1,000 died in a fairly short period of time. But the Spaniards were bewildered and some even horrified, as the Indian populations seemed to evaporate before their eyes. Because these diseases struck all age groups, there was little possibility of mitigating the mortality with an increased birth rate. While specialists differ with respect to numbers, which are necessarily somewhat speculative, we are clearly considering the greatest known population loss in human history, that is, mortality as a percentage of population. The population of central Mexico may well have fallen by almost 90% in 75 years. Estimates for Peru and Chile, where the diseases spread well before the arrival of Europeans, are almost as high. The death rate was even worse in the Caribbean, where pestilence coincided with the encomienda system and much mass slaughter. Estimates of Hispaniola's pre-Columbian Arawak Taino Indian population range from about 300,000 to 500,000. By the 1540s, there were fewer than 500 survivors. Though the word genocide has been recently used, the Spaniards clearly had no plan or motive for the systematic extermination of most Native Americans. On the contrary, the colonial entrepreneurs wanted to seize and exploit as many laborers as possible. Back in Castile, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand became increasingly concerned over the flow of reports documenting the appalling mortality and cruel treatment of Native Americans. Drawing on his extensive experience in the Caribbean, the great Catholic bishop Bartolomé de las Casas led the way in condemning the injustices of the encomienda system and publicizing the crimes committed against the Indians, who were worked all day and night, he reported, to enrich the encomenderos. Spain's famous new laws of 1542, influenced by Las Casas, sought in various ways to protect the Indians' rights, allowing them to own property, for example, and forbidding the Spaniards from working them in mines. These and other reforms were difficult if not impossible to enforce. But over a period of 3 centuries, the Spanish and Portuguese created a vast body of legislation intended to segregate and protect Native Americans from the exploitive forces of colonization. The immense tragedy, however, was a slow but almost universal replacement of Indian slaves with black Africans. As early as 1516, 2 of the most humane and sensitive witnesses to the horrors of the New World, Licenciado Zuazo and Bartolomé de las Casas, protectors of the Indians, called for the sparing of Indian lives, especially in the mines, by importing many more African slaves. For 25 years, Las Casas saw the importation of black slaves as the solution for the Spaniards' oppression of Indians. This substitution of Africans for Indians became a common pattern. The great Jesuit pioneer Manuel da Nóbrega arrived in Brazil in 1549 and courageously denounced the settlers for their mistreatment of Indians and later helped to restrict the enslavement of Indians. Yet Nóbrega, like Las Casas, appealed for the importation of more black slaves, both for the colony and for his own religious order. Nóbrega claimed that the legality of black slavery had been carefully weighed in the consciences of the people. There were also more compelling and pragmatic reasons for this racial replacement. Throughout the New World, colonists agreed that the labor of one black was worth that of several Indians. Unlike the Native Americans, most West Africans were familiar with large-scale agriculture, labor discipline, and making iron or even steel tools. They also shared with Europeans some resistance to Old World diseases. Still, it seems quite possible that if the Caribbean Indians had not been so susceptible to Old World pathogens, and if their food base had not been destroyed, they might have provided a significant labor force for Caribbean sugar plantations once the small gold supplies had been exhausted. The near extermination of native populations created an immense vacuum, easing the seizure of fertile land from Hispaniola to Peru by the Spaniards and in Brazil by the Portuguese, but in many regions this invasion left only a skeletal native population that could be coerced to perform heavy labor. Cortés made it clear that he and other conquistadors had no intention of pushing a plow, and the same could be said with respect to other Europeans who freely and voluntarily traveled to the Americas in search of a fortune. Western Europe contained no uprooted or surplus population willing to volunteer for heavy agricultural labor in the tropics, at least not until the 17th century, when England shipped tens of thousands of indentured servants and convicts to the Chesapeake and the Caribbean, especially Barbados. In time, this labor supply proved to be wholly inadequate, and the indentured servants were replaced by far larger numbers of African slaves. In short, while Europeans settled each New World colony in a special and often fortuitous way, we can also see a more general pattern being repeated from Hispaniola and Brazil in the 16th century to Virginia and Carolina in the 17th. First, we note a strongly human element of greed, a desire for instant wealth from gold and silver, whether stolen from Indians, seized from the Spaniards by Dutch, British, or French pirate ships, or gained from forcing Indians to work in the mines for mineral wealth. In a second and usually later alternative, colonial leaders turned to cash crops, such as tobacco and especially sugar, produced by slaves imported from Africa after initial experiments with Indian labor. For reasons we will later examine, the African workers could never come close to reproducing their numbers, except in the Chesapeake by the 1720s and in South Carolina a half-century later. Hence the need for a continuing and growing stream of labor from Africa to make up for slave mortality and to clear new land and found new colonies for cultivation. Much of the New World, then, came to resemble the death furnace of the ancient god Moloch, consuming African slaves so increasing numbers of Europeans and later white Americans could consume sugar, coffee, rice, and tobacco. And what about Africa? Historians still debate the long-term effects of 4 centuries of slave exports on Africa itself. The fairly recent emphasis on the equality of Euro-African trade negotiations has undermined any simplistic model of victimization, but a few key points need to be kept in mind. Clearly, the increasing external demand for slave labor led to the death of enormous numbers of Africans killed in wars of enslavement and driven like cattle, often bound by the neck, from interior locations to the coast. Many more died or longed for death as they were jammed into open barracoons or stone forts and then packed into the white men's slave ships. Since both Africans and Europeans favored the sale of males, the resulting preponderance of women in many West African societies helped to increase polygyny and more rapid reproduction. Overall, about 2/3 of the captives shipped from Africa to the New World were male. In the more decentralized societies, this same external demand encouraged kidnapping, as we saw in Chapter 1 with the capture in Sierra Leone of Cinque, the future leader of the Amistad Revolt. Over the centuries, village after village became the targets of surprise raids by bands of armed men. As the African historian Robert Harms comments, it was as if each such African person walked around with a price on his or her head. No less important was the rise of predatory states, such as Futa Jalone, Dahomey, Asante, Kasanji, and the Lunda Empire, which found it financially profitable to wage war on neighbors and sell prisoners to the Portuguese, Dutch, English, French, Danes, or Americans. These Africans mainly sold slaves for luxury goods, such as Asian and European textiles, rum and brandy, metal goods, bars of iron, tobacco, and personal ornaments, such as beads, copper armlets, and anklets. After about 1690, with the growing perfection of European firearms, the enslaving states became increasingly powerful as they exchanged slaves for gunpowder and the latest weapons. A relatively few African rulers, government officials, military officers, and merchants acquired symbols of wealth and status in exchange for the massive export of labor. But the slave trade did not stimulate an internal African economy. Indeed, when the European demand suddenly ended in the 1850s and 1860s, the African slave-making mechanisms continued to operate, flooding various regions with non-exportable slaves. There seemed to be no economic alternative. Finally, we should note that the geographic sources of slaves shifted over time. The Atlantic slave trade drew captives from a vast area, stretching 3,500 miles along the west and west-central African coast, from present-day Senegal in the north to the Kalahari Desert in Angola in the south, and from 500 to even 1,000 miles inland. During the 15th century, many captives came from Senegambia, the region that now encompasses Senegal, Gambia, northern Guinea, southern Mali, southern Mauritania, and Guinea-Bissau. By the early 16th century, West Central Africa, including present-day Congo and Angola, had begun to export significant numbers of slaves. It would ultimately provide about 44% of all the slaves shipped out of Africa. But beginning in the 1670s, with the emergence of British dominance of the trade, the Bight of Benin, western Nigeria and southeast Niger, then known as the Slave Coast, and the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, Burkina Faso, eastern Ivory Coast, and southern Niger, became the major slave-exporting regions. During the mid-18th century, the Bight of Biafra, an area that included western Cameroon and eastern Nigeria and Sierra Leone, also grew to be major sources of slaves. Africans from particular regions also tended to concentrate in particular parts of the New World. Thus, slaveholders in the Carolinas and Georgia purchased many slaves from West Central Africa, and many from Senegambia and Sierra Leone, who were sought for their rice cultivation skills. Virginians imported large numbers of Igbos and other peoples from the Bight of Biafra, as well as many Senegambian and Akan slaves. It seems clear that large numbers of enslaved Africans, from Muslims in Brazil to Angolans in Louisiana, retained their ethnic identities in the New World and organized social rituals, such as funerals and even revolts, along ethnic or national lines. This chapter is meant to underscore the central truth that black slavery was basic and integral to the entire phenomenon we call America. This often hidden or disguised truth ultimately involves the profound contradiction of a free society that was made possible by black slave labor. Until the late 1700s, none of the slave societies or societies with slaves, spread out around the world, had committed themselves to the twin ideals of liberty and equality, grounded in a dream or vision of historical progress. As I have tried to suggest, it was the larger Atlantic slave system, including North America's trade with the West Indies and the export of southern rice, tobacco, indigo, and finally cotton, that prepared the way for everything America was to become. Thus, vital links developed between the profit motive, which led to inhuman efforts to dehumanize African slaves, and the conception of the New World as an environment of liberation, opportunity, and upward mobility. Racial slavery became an intrinsic and indispensable part of New World settlement, not an accident or an unfortunate shortcoming on the margins of the American experience. From the very beginnings, America was part black, and indebted to the appalling sacrifices of millions of individual blacks who cleared the forests and tilled the soil. Yet even the ardent opponents of slaveholding could seldom, if ever, acknowledge this basic fact. To balance the soaring aspirations released by the American Revolution and by evangelical religion, in the First and Second Great Awakenings, slavery became the dark underside of the American dream, the great exception to our pretensions of perfection, the single barrier blocking our way to the millennium, the single manifestation of national sin. The tragic result of this formulation was to identify the so-called Negro, and the historically negative connotations of the word are crucial for an understanding of my point, as the great American problem. The road would be clear, everything would be perfect, if it were not for his or her presence. Such assumptions tainted some white and even black abolitionist writing, and lay behind the numerous projects and proposals for deporting or colonizing the black population outside the United States. Hence, the victims of the great sin of slavery became, in this subtle psychological inversion, the embodiment of sin, exemplified in the Negro's alleged and sometimes comic failings, indignities, and mistakes. For some 200 years, African Americans have struggled against accepting or above all internalizing this prescribed identity, this psychological curse.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.